Shalom, shalom, and welcome back to another episode of Biblical Live. Today I'll be dissecting Proverbs chapter 1, written by Solomon. So without further ado, let's get started. Let me just pull out my Bible. Okay, so from chapters 1 to 7, we have this first section that is independent by itself, and this is the opening. Chapter 1 is quite interesting. It sets up for the rest of all of Proverbs, so it's a really good introduction. I'll write out the whole chapter 1 in the description below so you can see it for reference, but yes, verses 1 to 7 is one part. The main part of the first section, the big takeaway of this is that in order for someone to truly understand something, we start off with three main components, which is we first are always a student. Then through a student, we learn and we listen. Through learning and listening, we gain experience. So that's the second part. Now, to truly make this experience strong and build your foundation upon this, we need to teach it. So that's the third part. And as you're teaching it, you're going to notice something very unique is that everyone responds very differently in the way that you teach. So therefore, the more you teach different groups, different people, you build a stronger arsenal of approaches. The topic doesn't change, like the wisdom of God does not change, but how you deliver that message does change depending on the other person's attributes, their personalities, their traits, their character, and generally just where they're at that moment specific of time. So for a teacher, it's very important to take note of all these things. Some people are very different in their stages of life, and so you have to be very in tune and aware of where they are. So someone who's older, you can be a little bit more strict, stern in the words. Someone who is, for example, someone who is a little bit more, going through a really tough time, it's good to be more compassionate, more kind, just more sympathetic, empathetic, relating with them. But the message itself still stands. So that's the big takeaway, is that is the main point. Now, in verse 7, it talks about the knowledge of God. This is very important. And also the fear of God. Okay, so the fear of God is probably, I think, is one of the most important things that one can have caring for themselves. It isn't worldly fear. It's more of a reverence. It's more of a respect. And it's more of an honoring. But this fear of ADONAI is extremely important. Without it, we end up letting our egos take over, or letting our achievements take over, letting our accomplishments take over, and we lose perspective and lose sight of who's really the one who's really running this universe. So fearing ADONAI will always put you in a spot where you're like, okay, I got humble myself a little bit more and know that God is in control, and therefore I must trust him. This fear also puts us in check of obeying the commandments laid out for us. So it is important that we come to realize that, that these commandments are more beneficial for us. It's more of a blessing than these rules that we need to follow. Following these commandments will actually help us become happier. It truly does. And so that fear will in turn also enrich your wisdom and your knowledge, God's knowledge. Okay? Now, in life, I believe, there's three things that we get to really take away. I know in biblical texts, they always say, you enter this world naked and you leave in this world naked. There's nothing we can take away. None of our fame, none of our riches, none of our achievements. There's nothing that we can take out of life. A rich man's grave is the same as a poor man's grave. So, but there is something that God gifts us. And there's three parts that we get to keep as something for the afterlife. And the first part is our memory. Our memory is something that we get to keep from young age to old. Now, whether you want to keep that memory or not, that's up to you. But you get to keep memory. Memory is very precious. Second thing we get to keep is experience. The experiences that we racked up throughout life. And then the third thing that we get to keep is God's knowledge. And within God's knowledge is contained His wisdom, everything contained of this world. So anything from science, psychology, from all academic, from sports, from how the universe works, how nature works, that this is contained as God's knowledge, because there's no knowledge outside of God's thinking. So everything that is in this world that humanity has discovered is considered God's knowledge. So for example, we can play around with the periodic table, but we can't create a new element because God didn't create a new element. There's no new elements out there. We can combine elements, but there's none that we can just create out of thin air. God can create things out of thin air. We can't do that. So that's what it means by God's knowledge, is that it's already contained. Everything that when He created the world, everything was already contained, and we're just there discovering it. So God's knowledge is in that context. Okie dokie. Next part. That's a lot more than I wanted to say from verse 1 to 7, but you get the idea. Verses 8 to 10 is setting up for verse 11 all the way through 21. And this part is very good. It's more like, it's more like a good parent teaching to a young child of their child of discipline. And discipline is extremely important. It's not the conventional, or I shouldn't say conventional, it's not what the world view of discipline is. Discipline is really down to this habitual practice that we do. Just kind of like, don't throw dirty socks around the house. That's just a part of discipline. Brush your teeth. Bathe from time to time, daily, things like that. Wash the dishes, cleaning. So these are disciplinary acts. We do it over and over and over to keep our mind and our body in that realm of doing what we've been practicing. There comes a time when we do this long enough, it actually becomes part of us. So you'll see this in top sports boxers, for example, where they've been so disciplined in their art that even when they are fighting unconsciously, they can still fight, which is really scary. It's like their body goes on this autopilot moment, and they can still pull off crazy moves that they don't have any recollection of. And so habitual practice helps us get into that zone where your body does it so many times throughout many years that it's just so ingrained in us that we don't necessarily need to think. So I think that's very important, that habitual practice is ingrains discipline. And you'll read that why discipline is so important. So it guards you. It really does. It protects you, and it guards you, but also it keeps you in harm's way, and you make better decisions. So that's why it's good to have discipline. It sets you up really well. People who don't have discipline run around chasing lucid dreams on very weak, shallow foundations. Okay. Next part. So from verse 11 all the way to 21. This is a pretty big dissection in itself, but I'm just gonna sum it up real quick. Solomon is using the worst type of commitment you can do, and that is basically taking someone's life, or a group of people enjoying that sensation, that sport of taking people's life, and he's basically warning you as the reader not to participate, not to partake in it, even though it makes you feel really strong, like very dominant, very powerful, like you have full control over these people's lives. That's basically why these people like to take lives. It makes them feel dominant. And so Solomon is warning the reader not to partake. Now, how does that apply in our own daily life nowadays, 2,000 years later? It might not even be killing someone. It could be anything from social media, from your lust, from women, from men, from money. All these things. He's just warning you not to, no matter how enticing it seems at the moment, he's warning the reader to stay away, because you're now walking away from God's path that he has in store for you. And yeah, so that's what I would like to say about that part. The word Sheol in, where is this? Verse 12, Sheol is basically another word for hell. So people who partake in taking people's lives and doing all these crazy things in the world, they end up not having any fear for ADONAI. They feel like they're in full control. Their egos take over, and they don't feel the consequences of their actions don't scare them at all. Their death doesn't scare them. So that just goes to show why fearing ADONAI is very important. Okay, Now we get to the last bit. Oh, I like the analogy that they make. The bird. Where's that bird? Okay, verse 17. For in vain is the net baited, if any bird can see it. So, in a way, it's if we can use this analogy as fish too. So, any netted thing that you put in to catch fish, the fish really can't see the bait, and so they're catching themselves. In a way, in the modern description of this is you're digging your own grave. They're basically digging their own grave, like evil people dig their own grave. Evil will always attack evil. Boastfulness, one person who's boastful, who meets another person who's boastful, they'll end up conflicting with each other. That's the bottom line. And like it's almost like goats with horns. When they see each other, they're always like, who's the stronger one? So that's the analogy they're saying. Politicians do this too, both sides, left or right. They end up butting heads, and they just keep going. There's no concisive decision that they would make in a neutral ground. They just like butting heads, so you just let them butt heads. That's basically what God says, is just let them butt heads. They're being fools in a ways, and then you get the response from God himself. So 20 to 23 is this length of time. How long? It's God likes to play time a lot. So how long is not there's no definite time frame. It's kind of like the word soon. Soon is also, there's no time frame. To us, soon could be a day or two. To God, who's lived for billions of years, soon could be 1,000 years. Simply like that. How long is now in perspective? Are we talking humanity's perspective? Or are we talking God's perspective? Are we talking ants' perspective, or are we talking bacterial perspective? How long? So it's down to who are we referring to when we say how long. And you'll see God is asking this question almost like from the beginning of time. Like you see people don't turn from their ways, from Adam and Eve, from Cain and Abel, from Noah, where there was so much wickedness, from Abraham, Lot, Sodom and Gomorrah. And it just keeps going. The Tower of Babel. How long is humanity going to continue doing this, where they just reject God, reject his word, reject his commandments, not fearing him, showing reverence to the Creator. And the answer is basically from beginning of time to the end of time, where you get to see that in Revelations. Like people haven't turned from their ways. And this last bit is gonna throw people off, but I find it very fascinating. Where God, verse 23, God gives a chance for people to repent. Are you gonna? He gives that chance. Would you rather repent, or would you rather have full judgment from God upon death? So I like to see death as a gavel in court, where your time's up, and then that's it. court decision is done. Everything is done, and the decision is made. There's no turning back. There's no second chances. There's no second guessing on the decision made. That's when judgment is for everyone's life, is when their gavel hits, when their life ends. God makes the decision whether you go to heaven or hell. "24 to the end is basically those that reject God's offer of repentance. He's just gonna laugh at you. He's gonna laugh at your distress. He's gonna let you continue that way in a lot of ways. In Psalms, I believe. Yes, there's, I can't remember which Psalms, but anyway, I'll paraphrase. Is that he lets his people, a lot of times he lets children of God die first. And the worldly view would be like, why would they do that? But in God's eyes, it's actually a saving grace, where he is saving his people from this oppression of sin that exists in this world. So, third world countries where the poverty runs real deep, children don't live long, but at the same time they don't live long in this world, but they live for eternity in heaven. So that's the trade-off. Or people, abortionist cases where life is given, and they never even got the chance to live in this life. But people who live in this life know how sometimes it's miserable. And to even be born in a family who don't even see life from conception, God would just be like, I'd rather have my kid in heaven. If you don't want your kid on this earth, I would rather take it. So yes, it's very interesting, and a lot of times he would let world leaders who are corrupt run the world even longer, and they end up suffering longer in this world, and then they end up suffering even longer on the underworld. So it's kind of God's way of showing his wrath. And I find this last bit very interesting of Proverbs from 20 onward, where God is just letting humanity know, like, hey, you live however you like, and you'll get whatever you deserve. World leaders that mess up the world, they don't sleep well. You'll see them age really quick. They get a lot of hate, a lot of pressure from society, butting heads between two groups. And like people who are, celebrities, they don't sleep well. They get attacked from fame. Michael Jackson is a great case. Just look at his life. When you uncover his life, you'll notice how much dirt and how much pain and suffering he had, and he was covering up with a lot of weird stuff. That's all I like to say about that. But what I'm saying is, God lets people choose. Like, you want to be a part of me, or you don't want to be a part of me. And if you are a part of me, you'll find this eternal internal peace. If you don't want to be a part of me, continue free living the way you do. Goats butting heads. Evil fighting evil. And at the end of the day, unclean spirits, demonic spirits, they really have no sympathy for you. And if two people who don't believe, you know, it's just like two demonic forces are like, yeah, let's mess these two people up, these two groups up. They don't care. To them, it's just human life is just entertainment, and they like seeing human life suffer. So that's really down to these two choices. Either you want to be part of God's holiness, God's circle of family, or you want to be a part of it, away from it. And that's the decision that God leaves for the reader at the end of Proverbs chapter 1, which I find is very fascinating. Proverbs chapter 1 sets up for the rest, and you'll see this dissection where Solomon is breaking it up, all these little things. But the main point comes down to chapter 1. He's basically dissecting chapter 1. And so I find chapter 1 is quite fascinating. It's really unique on its own. This video is a little bit longer than I would like. But yes, enjoy the rest of the day. Hope you're having a good day. And God bless. Peace be unto you. Take care. Cheers.